If you've been doing hip thrusts, Bulgarian split squats, squats, kickbacks, RDLs, and you're getting sore every session, but your glutes are still looking the same months later, this video is for you. So there's a common misconception that just because you do all of these exercises 2 to 3 times a week, then you are automatically going to see glute growth, but that's not true. And that's evident just by looking in the gym and seeing that there's plenty of people doing these exercises, but they look the same month after month. They're not seeing any significant progress. And the reason for this is because growth has very little to do with exercise selection in isolation or how often you do that in isolation. And that's the part that nobody really talks about because at the end of the day, muscles are going to respond to not just the exercises you do, but how you apply those exercises throughout your program. Because there's plenty of people doing these exercises, but they don't take it a step further and make sure that the way they lay out these exercises in their program actually makes sense for their goals. So if you're somebody who's looking to see growth in your glutes specifically, you have to take it a step further and look at how you are strategically applying certain training variables throughout your program. So when we zoom out and look at what actually drives growth, there's a couple things that you really have to pay attention to. And sorry, I was getting a call. And this applies to all muscles, but we're talking about glutes in particular because this is a common question that I always get, especially with my woman clients. What's up, Latisse, baby? So with my clients, and I'm losing my train of thought. All right, so this applies to all exercise, all muscle groups, but specifically with glutes, a lot of people are in the gym doing these exercises, but you really have to pay attention to whether you're getting enough volume throughout the week. So when I say volume, I'm talking about how many working sets you're getting for your glutes. So not warm-up sets, not where you're just doing lightweight, those don't count. So if your program says 3 sets of 10, those don't count your warm-up sets. We're talking 3 hard sets close to failure. And people tend to go through their workouts and go through their sessions without ever paying attention to how close they get to failure. So you'll notice that you maybe programmed 3 sets of 10, but then when you get to 10, you can still do like 5 more reps. That does not count as a working set. So if you notice that you're in the gym and you're doing that and you're finishing your set at 10 just because your program calls for that, you're doing yourself a disservice because if you want to grow your glutes, you need to have that intensity there. You need to have that proximity to failure. So if you don't have that, that's not going to count towards the volume you need for your glutes. And when you're talking about volume for muscle growth, it's a big range of how many sets you can ideally get for a muscle you're looking to grow. So if you're a beginner, like say you are totally new to the gym, you never lifted weights before, anywhere from 10 to 15 sets a week is going to be ideal for you. But as you accumulate more experience in the gym, you're going to need a lot more volume. So that's when you can start pushing to 20 sets a week, 30 sets a week. But there's this big range. So you really just have to take into account where you are in terms of your experience level and then how much time you have to dedicate throughout the gym to the gym throughout the week. So this is when like workout splits are really important because if you are thinking about how many sets you have to accumulate to grow your glutes, you can't just fit 10 working sets into you need 300 a week. You can't just fit 10 working sets into a session. So this is when you may do 2 lower body days, or if you're only training 2 times a week, then you may need 2 full body days because your glutes aren't the only muscle that's important. So these are things that people tend to overlook. So volume is a big one. So you want to get anywhere from 10 to 30 sets. You want to take those sets close to failure. So aiming to be within anywhere from 0 to 3 reps in reserve. So by the time you get to the end of your set, you should feel like you can only do 1, 2, maybe 3 more reps. If you can do more than that, you need to run that set back and do that shit again. So that's a big thing. And then also progressive overload. So when people hear the term progressive overload, they tend to think just add more weight. That works until it doesn't. It works when you're a beginner, when you're like new to the gym. You'll notice that you're able to just add weight week after week. Say you start hip thrust with 90 pounds, you might be able to do 90 that first week, 90 that first week, 100 the next week, 110, and you can see that incremental increase week after week. But at a certain point, that levels off, and you have to figure out different ways to apply progressive overload. And progressive overload, in simple terms, is just making things a little bit harder than they were before, and that goes beyond just adding weight. If we were all able to continue to add weight week after week, we'd all be lifting like 500 pounds on every exercise, and we know that that's not the case. So that's when you can start doing different forms of progressive overload. So adding more sets, which eventually you run out of time, because who the hell wants to be in the gym doing 5 sets of each exercise? So sets is something you can do early on, but you don't want to. Everybody's blowing my fucking phone up. You don't want to do that, especially when you're somebody who's not trying to dedicate 2 or 3 hours in the gym when it's not even necessary. You can also play around with your reps in reserve. So what I mean by that is, say on week 1, you do a set where you end with only, let's say, 3 reps in reserve. You're 3 reps shy of failure. The next week, you can try to get 2 reps shy of failure. The following week, you can get 2 failure and see where your numbers are and then recalibrate that way. So progressive overload goes beyond just adding weight, and these are things that people don't necessarily look at. Another big one is proper execution, so that you are using the right muscles. When it comes to glute exercises, people tend to get the form wrong and end up distributing the load to either primarily the hamstrings or your lower back. So a good example of this is, or even quads. So a good example of this is, say when you're doing an RDL, you are feeling it more in your lower back, because as you go down, you're not keeping your core engaged, you're starting to extend your lumbar spine, and that's taking pressure off of, or work off of, the glutes, and you're using your lower back a little more, your hamstrings a little more. So really dialing in your form to be specific to the muscles you're targeting is really important. And this is also why sometimes people are having more quad growth than glute growth, because they're squatting their RDLs. So instead of actually hinging at the hips, they're getting that range of motion from their knees, and biomechanically that's going to get your quads more engaged. And that's what's going to cause you to say, hey, I'm quad dominant, I can't grow my glutes, when in reality, you just aren't moving correctly. So making sure that you have proper execution is going to be major key. Next one that came up today actually is, somebody was doing a stiff-legged RDL, and with the stiff-legged RDL, they were saying that they were feeling their hamstrings more than their glutes, which that's great and all, but when you think about the exercises that you are going to need to grow your glutes, you have to make sure that the exercise makes sense for what you're doing. So if you're saying that you want to grow your glutes, you will benefit from a more glute dominant RDL than a stiff-legged RDL. So I bring that example up just because there's a lot of flashy exercises that come up online, and you may not need that exercise. So in order to know which ones you need to have a little bit of discernment and actually take time to think about what you're consuming online, because there's a lot of things going around on social media, and you may see somebody that has a nice body, nice butt, nice legs, and you want that, so you think you have to do the exact exercises that they're doing, but in reality, it has to make sense for your goal, and it also has to make sense for all of the things you have in your program. You're not just going to do a stiff leg RDL in a good morning and just because they are all hinges, you think that they're good for your glutes. You really have to have a lot more specificity to the exercises that are in your program. So this is why it's really important to have a structured program that takes a look at all the exercises you're doing on a weekly basis, because if not, you end up doing a lot of redundant exercises. And when it comes to your glute muscles, you have three of them. And if you're just hitting your glutes from the same angles with different exercises that are inherently the same movement pattern, you're going to be leaving a lot of gains on the table. So you want to make sure the things you're doing actually make sense for what you say you want to achieve. So when people are talking about, hey, I am seeing more quad growth than glute growth, what is really usually happening is that they have more volume that's directed towards the quads across the week. So you'll notice that their program has like a lot of walking lunges, knee extensions, squats. They lack a lot of hinge movements. They're not doing enough volume of hip thrust and RDLs. And with that, what you're going to get is more focus on your quads, even though there's a lot of overlap that happens between the exercises that grow your quads and your glutes. So if you look at a program that's designed for quad growth and a program that's designed for glute growth, you're going to notice that the exercises are fairly similar. You're always going to see some form of a squat, a hinge, so RDL, a hip thrust, possibly a deadlift, depending on what strength goals they have. You're going to notice a split squat, a step up, and these are all in some kickbacks, obviously, for the glutes, knee extensions, hamstring curls, things like that. But you're going to notice that the main difference between the programs is not the exercises that you're doing, it's more so how you distribute that volume. So a program that's created for more glute volume, you're not going to see a lot of like knee extensions and walking lunges, things that really give you a lot of quad volume. You're going to see more of like kickbacks and lose my train of thought. Kickbacks, hip thrusts, maybe like high box step ups. Those are things that are going to get your glutes a lot more. So it's not necessarily the exercises that are going to change. It's more so how you focus your attention on each exercise. So you may be doing like two or three exercises that are geared to quads in isolation, but then you have like 4 or 5 exercises that are geared to glutes. So it's not necessarily the exercises that change. It's more so how you manipulate the amount of exercises you're doing throughout the week. And then you also get people who end up coming to the conclusion that because they feel their quads are bigger than their glutes, they want to do only glute dominant exercises, which in reality is totally backwards, because as long as your knee is straightening out and as long as your hips are going from a bent position to a straightened position, you're always going to be using your quads and you're always going to be using your glutes. So trying to turn off your glutes or your quads in an exercise where they both have to work is kind of like trying to do a push-up without bending your elbows. Like you have to bend your knee to do a squat. You have to bend your knee to do a lunge. So your quads are always going to be involved. So instead of trying to make everything glute dominant and turn off your quads when it's literally biomechanically impossible, we have to start thinking about controlling these important variables. So once you start understanding this, you have less apprehension and less fear to specific exercises, and you end up learning how to train a little bit better in terms of how to align your program to achieve what you want. Because in most cases, you don't have to omit any exercises. You more so have to just think about how often you're doing exercises, how many sets you're getting for those muscle groups. And once you zoom out and look at it like that, you'll end up realizing that you can actually do all exercises and still not blow up your quads if you don't want to. Obviously, if you want to grow your quads, that's totally fine, but it is a real fear for a lot of women to have bigger quads and not have like the glutes to go with it. So if that's something that you feel like you're concerned with and you want to avoid, you really have to start to pay attention to volume, intensity, and proper exercise selection and execution based on your goal, not the ones you're seeing online. So if you're watching this and you're wondering whether your program is actually set up for what you say you want, then grab the lifter's audit. I'm going to link it in the comments, and You can grab it there. It literally walks you through how to set up your program for whatever goal you want. And if you have any questions, I'll be here to answer them. Just drop them in the comments. I'll circle back later. But I just wanted to come on here and share this because it was top of mind. So grab the Lift This audit in the comment or drop audit and I'll send it to you personally. With that being said, I'll catch you guys later. Peace.